Hello, and welcome to today's live chapter reading of True Colors, Book 3 in the Colors Trilogy, written by K.R. Raye, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Pizza Delivery, July 2006. I love you, Imani, Marco Cabrette said as he adjusted his cell phone while he drove. You got the pizzas already? Imani Cabrette asked. Check, he replied, taking another whiff of the two large pepperoni and sausage pies sitting on the passenger seat. There's nothing like Nino's authentic New York style pizza. Well, too bad Nino's doesn't deliver because Melody and Chris just put up the movies and cracked out the Scrabble board. They said they're ready for their Scrabble butt whipping. Oh, please, not likely, Marco heard Melody mutter in the background. Imani chuckled. How far away are you, sweetie? I'm turning onto the main drag now. I should be home in less than 5 minutes. Perfect. We'll be waiting, she said sweetly. And Marco? Yes, baby. I love you too. Marco disconnected with a big grin and tossed the phone on top of the pizza boxes. Feeling relaxed, he drummed his thumbs against the steering wheel. An erratic movement caught his full attention. His relaxed state dissipated like mist as he leaned forward in his seat. Bright summer sunlight filtered across the usually busy two-lane road. Even though it was a little before 6 p.m. on a Saturday night, traffic was lighter than normal. Thank goodness for small favors. As he squinted, then frowned, both hands tightened around the steering wheel. About a quarter mile ahead, an oncoming white SUV left its lane and crossed directly into his. The only other car in Marco's lane swerved out of the SUV's way and rattled past onto the shoulder while it honked wildly. Marco honked and considered following the earlier car's path, but the Ford Explorer adjusted and now straddled both Marco's lane and the shoulder. With the distance between them closing faster than he liked, options sprinted through his mind. Taking the only valid choice, he veered to the left into the oncoming traffic lane. If he could just get past the SUV, there was nothing except open road ahead, and he'd be back in his lane well before anyone else even came into sight. Please stay on the wrong side of the road, he prayed aloud as he bit his lip. However, a scant second later, his prayers morphed into a moan. The Explorer, whose driver seemed deadly intent on playing chicken, straightened up back into his correct lane. Damn it, he shouted as he smacked the steering wheel. Only a few car lengths separated them from a head-on collision, and with Marco clearly driving on the wrong side of the street, the cops would easily find him at fault. Gritting his teeth, he floored his Honda in a last-ditch effort and swerved hard to the right, scuttling back into his lane. Too late, he realized his mistake as the Explorer driver reacted and steered towards him again. What the hell, he yelled as the driver countered his very action, like some fool playing real-life bumper cars. In one heartbeat, the Explorer smashed into his driver's side door, crumpling his car around him. Oddly enough, he didn't feel any pain. Adrenaline, he mused. The random thought fluttered away as he noticed that the still accelerating Explorer had their pinned cars hurtling towards a solid wall of pine trees off to his right. Determined to slow their impact, he stood on the brakes while random memories flashed like light bulbs. His mother bustling about her Italian kitchen, his father laughing at a raucous joke he'd told, his sister, Maria, imparting her sweet wisdom. Bits and pieces of the Lord's Prayer, Psalm 23, and Hail Mary flitted through his mind before it stuck on a simple children's prayer. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen. Imani's face floated in front of him, warm and beautiful. I love you, Imani, he whispered as the Explorer rammed them into the pines. Metal screeched and wailed while glass shattered and rained down as his Honda melded around the biggest tree. Blinding pain seared him for a millisecond while the smells of burnt rubber, pine needles, gasoline, and pizza commingled in his nostrils like some bizarre cologne. And then, nothing. A cold, heavy hand of dread settled on Imani's scalp. Its icy fingers slithered down her spine and chills ricocheted throughout her body. Without warning, it slammed a fistful of lead into her gut. A scream died in her throat as the pain forced her to inhale a sharp, jagged breath. Everything began to move in freakish, funhouse slow motion, and her vision telescoped out like the exits in horror movies that went from being just 2 feet away to yards away down a steadily expanding hallway. Trying to steady herself, she never even realized that she'd leapt up from the dining room table until she saw the Scrabble board fly across it. Scrabble tiles scattered and tinkled onto the floor with champagne glass clinks. Melody Wilkins and Chris Weaver turned their heads towards her in unison. Are you okay? Chris's amber flecked gray eyes stared at her like she'd gone berserk. His normally cute, boyish features and wild blonde hair morphed into an absurdist painting with each light tan freckle highlighted. Although they'd hung out a bit over the years as coworkers, and even more after Chris and Melody became an item, she realized that Chris had never experienced her weird sixth sense, but Melody had. Imani ignored Chris and locked eyes with her old college roommate. Imani, what's wrong? Melody asked as she ran over in slow motion, each blonde curl bouncing like a protracted spring about her golden tanned face. Her usually optimistic green gray eyes shimmered with concern. Although Imani felt her mouth moving, it took centuries before the words actually emerged. Marco, she replied with her heart and mind racing. Something's wrong with Marco. Marco? Chris asked, visibly bewildered. You just got off the phone with him less than 3 minutes ago. Shaking her head slow as molasses on a cold wintry day, Imani grabbed Melody's shoulders. You have to take me to him, please. What? Melody's eyes widened. Where? Imani ignored Melody's questions. Dear God, help, please. Overwhelmed by premonitions more intense than she'd ever experienced before, she began to hyperventilate. Images whisked past at warp speed, and she felt compartments of her mind closing like hurricane shutters, protecting windows from the impending storm. The little hairs on Melody's neck stood on end. Somehow, in that instant, she believed that Imani knew the unknowable. Get your keys, Chris, she said before helping Imani outside and into the back seat of Chris's car. Chris got in with a shrug. Do you mind telling me where we're going? Imani rocked and mumbled to herself with her eyes cast downward. Over the 7 years they'd known each other, she'd never seen her strong, determined friend act like this. It was as if Imani were devolving into a catatonic state right before her eyes. Imani's beautiful walnut skin turned ashen. Her sharp, brown eyes focused inward and muddy, and her entire athletic frame seemed to implode into a sack of bones and skin. Melody looked at Chris unsure. Just drive 2 minutes to the main road and turn left. Nino's is 3 blocks from there, about a mile down on the right. Okay, he muttered, still skeptical. Turning onto the main road, they saw emergency lights blazing in the opposite lane. A fire truck and ambulance pulled onto the scene as they approached. No, 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 screamed Imani. It may not be him, Melody said, trying to comfort Imani while starting to panic inside. As they pulled near, an officer began directing traffic away from the accident. Chris pulled up to him and rolled down his window. Move along, please, the gruff officer said, assuming they were bold rubberneckers. I'm sorry, sir, Melody said, but our girlfriend here thinks her husband was involved in the wreck. The officer leaned down and peered into the vehicle. What? My husband was in the Navy Honda, Imani said, eerily calm. Her eyes appeared eagle-focused again as they beseeched the policeman to help. Pull over here out of the way, he said, pointing to a bit of the median out of the path of traffic. It's still distant from the accident. I'll check your story out, he shouted, directing the other cars around. Another officer came over to investigate the problem. They talked for a moment, and the first officer walked to their car. Do you know your husband's license plate number, ma'am? Imani sat catatonic in the back seat again. Melody shuddered and covered for her. Oh, God. It was a personalized vanity plate with his name on it. She could feel Imani recommence rocking, and it sent goosebumps sprouting along her arms. The license plate was Marco. Marco. Did you get that? The officer asked, speaking into the two-way radio attached at the shoulder of his uniform. Roger, a scratchy reply emitted from the radio. Moments later, the scratchy voice replied, Roger, the rear license plate reads Marco. Arctic chills coursed through Melody's body, and Chris turned to stare at Imani like he'd just seen a ghost. Imani flung open her rear passenger door and rocketed from the car like an ejector seat. No, God, please, no, she screamed, running towards the accident. A startled paramedic saw her first before the officer, Chris, or Melody could react. Quick on his feet, the paramedic grabbed her around the waist and swung her away from the carnage. All Imani saw before the paramedic officer and her friends pulled her away was Marco's beautiful, wavy black, shoulder length hair, matted with blood and safety glass fragments dangling around his limp neck. His little blue Honda sat unrecognizably mangled and fused together with the large, crumpled white SUV. Melody sat shell shocked in the passenger seat, feeling completely drained, while Chris drove them back to Imani and Marco's house in stunned silence. After they'd wrestled Imani back to the car, the paramedics had pronounced Marco dead at the scene. Thankfully, the paramedics and cops spared them the horror of driving to the morgue to identify the body. Melody sighed, then glanced back at Imani, but Imani hadn't moved a muscle since they'd left the accident site. As Chris pulled into the driveway, Imani's cell rang, startling them. In a flash, Melody unfastened her seatbelt, jumped out, and answered it. Baby, what's wrong? Imani's mother's frantic voice bellowed over the line. Hi, Mrs. Jordan, Melody replied, not wanting to say more. This is Melody. Mrs. Jordan gasped, clearly taken aback by Melody answering her daughter's phone. Melody? Melody, where is Imani? What's wrong with my daughter? I feel something awful. Where is she? She's here, Mrs. Jordan. She's okay. Melody fibbed, then hesitated, her mouth reluctant to speak the words. There was an accident. It's Marco. Marco didn't make it. Oh my God, my poor baby. Melody heard Mrs. Jordan address her husband next. Pack our bags. Honey, our baby needs us. With tears choking her voice, Mrs. Jordan came back on the line again. We're on our way up, Melody. Make sure my baby's okay.